My name's Heather Burns, and this morning we're going to have a discussion about privacy, data protection, and open source development. What I'm going to teach you this morning is a little bit about the different ways we view online privacy, why this matters to us as developers and as creators of open source content management systems, and what I think we can do to bridge these divides in our work and make it better for everyone who uses the things we create. So who am I? Don't ask me at this hour. As Amy said, I'm from Glasgow, Scotland. I really apologize for bringing the weather with me. I designed my first website in 1997, which involved dialing into my university's Unix system, like actually dialing up with a phone cord tethered to the laptop to code in the Lynx text browser through a Unix telnet. So that tells you how old I am. I was always the go-to girl for the website in any job I had. And after a various series of events, I was a professional website designer from 2007 to 2015. Is that right? Yeah. Working with charities, not-for-profits, mostly in Scotland. But I started my career in politics and policy, and that's something that stays in your blood. And I always took a really keen interest in issues that pertain to my work but touched on policy, such as accessibility law, privacy law. And I started writing and speaking and doing more on that to the point where one day I just decided that's what I wanted to do. So I gave away all my clients. It was great. And I now work exclusively in digital law and tech policy. As I said, that tends to involve anything from privacy to e-commerce law to accessibility, but out of sheer necessity, most of the past 2 years of my life have been taken up by GDPR. So that informs what we're going to talk about today, but it's not everything we're going to talk about today. And I do need to advise you that I am not a lawyer, and nothing we're going to talk about today should be taken as legal advice. So obviously privacy is changing. And we're changing in the process. It's been really remarkable for me that I've been speaking and writing about this stuff for years and years, but even in the past couple of months, even since I agreed to speak at this conference, there's been so much momentum pointing in that direction. Obviously, you will know that we have recently had a privacy overhaul in Europe through GDPR. This went live last Friday. It replaced the existing European privacy regime, which was the Data Protection Directive of 1995, which was even before I made that first Lynx telnet site. It's always been quite remarkable to me that everything we've ever done and created on the web has been with what was a 23-year-old piece of legislation from the dial-up and floppy disk era. GDPR, very little of it is new. It maintains everything we already had for the past 23 years. What it's done is it's updated and modernized things that simply didn't exist when we first drew that up in the 90s. GDPR deals with what we call data at rest, collection, usage, and retention. But what people don't realize is GDPR is only half of the European privacy regime. The other half is a piece of legislation called the e-privacy directive. And this was supposed to have its own revamp and go live last Friday as well. But European committee processes being what they are, it's still in draft. And all the powers that be are really nipping at them to say, will you please get this done already? But no matter what happens, the earliest we're possibly going to see this revamp is maybe late autumn, maybe early winter. So this replaces the e-privacy directive of 2002, and this deals with data in transit, cookies, telemetry, advertising beacons. You know it as the cookie law, which isn't exactly accurate, but it is going to be revamped. So we're going to have a lot more to do again next year. You're not off the hook just because of next Friday. But what's been interesting to me is that while I've been working up to my eyeballs on the European privacy overhaul, we've had a couple of things happen in America, you might have noticed. And now they have no fewer than 5 different pieces of draft privacy legislation that they're going to be taking a look at. I don't expect you to read these and know them. There might even be more that I don't know about. It's really hard to keep track. Not all of these are good. Some of them are frankly rubbish. Some of them are politically motivated. Some of them have been made with a big chip on their shoulder. But all of these approximate little bits of what we have in GDPR. Now, why does that matter? It matters because for better or for worse, much of the work we do on the web is either created or grounded in the United States. We're here in Europe. I know that there's live streams to 4 countries, and I'm really grateful to you for watching today. And I'm not excluding you by discussing this, but for the ease of this discussion, we're going to concentrate on the United States and Europe. We have very, very different legal and cultural approaches to privacy. And in all the years I've been doing this work, I've realized that this next couple of slides, this is the missing link. This is where we've gone wrong, and this is where we need to build bridges. We need to understand each other. So here's the European cultural approach to privacy. In Europe, we hold that privacy is a fundamental human right. We actually put that into law. We hold that data belongs to the subject. So the information you create in an account, that is yours, you own it. We have what I call an opt-in culture in Europe, which is if you want a company or a service or whoever to take your information, you have to give them that permission to do it before they can do it. We have a culture of constructive work, cooperative work, through data protection regulators, through authority bodies, through even discussion not involving any third party. Fines, court action, things like that, they are rare and they are only a last resort when all of the constructive and cooperative things didn't work or if there was something truly egregious that merited it. And in general, people trust governments and fear businesses. Now let's look at the American cultural approach to privacy. The American approach holds that free speech, not privacy, is the fundamental human right. And in fact, in various court cases in the United States, privacy of data has actually been seen as an impediment to freedom of speech. The American approach holds that data belongs to whoever's owning it. So the data you create when you set up an account belongs to the company, even though it's about you. The United States has what I call an opt-out culture, which is they assume the right to take your data, and if you don't like it, you have to give them your opt-out after they've already taken it, compared to the European approach, where you have to give them permission to take it in the first place. The American approach is a culture of adversarial courtroom litigation. You hear people saying things like, who's going to prosecute me? Who's going to call the cops? Who's going to go to jail? They live in a culture where it's about a judge in a courtroom banging a gavel. So that is what they think about when they think about privacy. And people very much fear governments and trust businesses. They might not be happy with what Facebook does with their data, but they'll be damned if the government's going to make a law against it. We also have very different legal approaches to privacy. So here, privacy is regulated through hard law, GDPR, the e-privacy directive, your national data protection regulators. There's one overarching law for all member states and sectors, and that is GDPR. It doesn't matter if you're a one-woman business working in Scotland, a corporation working in the Netherlands, a studio working in France, a university in Portugal. You're all covered by the same set of rules. We have data protection regulators in Europe. These are people who, if there's a problem or concern, you take it to them and they handle the situation. The European approach is not tied to citizenship or nationality. All of you in this room, regardless of where you're from, right now are protected under Dutch privacy law, which stems from European law. And we hold that privacy is its own law. It's its own set of rules, it's its own set of guidance. It lives on its own. And as I said before, litigation, courtroom action, punishments, they are only ever a last resort in cases where they're actually really needed or if you were just truly being uncooperative and difficult. Contrast that with the American approach. Privacy isn't regulated, privacy is governed. It's governed through soft law, industry codes of conduct, terms and conditions. It's basically people writing that they promised to do something, but there's nothing to hold them to that. There is no overarching data protection law, nothing like we have here. It's a very piecemeal approach across sectors and states. You may have heard of HIPAA, which is the American law about medical and health information. You may have heard about COPPA, which is the law about anything related to minors, children using data. You may have heard of California privacy law, which is great if you're in California. But whether or not your data is protected and whether or not you have rights over it just depends on where it is and what it is. There's no data protection regulator because there's nothing to regulate. It is very much tied to citizenship and nationality, and this is why we have Americans going apoplectic about GDPR, saying, I'm not in Europe, why do I have to follow it? Privacy is barely its own law in the United States. It's seen as sort of a subcategory of contract tort or even property law. So, for example, you may have heard about the FCC's consent order about Facebook. The only way they can get Facebook in the United States is by saying they broke a contract, not by saying they broke privacy law, because there's no privacy law for them to have violated. And of course, litigation's the first resort. Sue first, ask questions later. And when it comes to those cultural and legal differences, we don't always agree to disagree. Here are a couple of things that Europeans say about the American approach to privacy. Why is it the Wild West? Even before GDPR starts, they're violating the rules. Their tone is still far from acknowledging the serious concerns people have. A lack of progress may challenge the effectiveness of self-regulation in this area and may increase the pressure to legislate. And of course, we thank you for appearing to testify before our committee today. That's what Europeans say. Here's what Americans say about the European approach to privacy. Jackbooted thugs. It could significantly interrupt transatlantic commerce and create unnecessary barriers to trade. That's Donald Trump's Commerce Secretary this week. The European approach runs the risk of being insensitive to context. There should be no government involvement. That's a direct quote from a lady in a focus group. And this last one, it's an interesting quote from a US senator who's introduced one of the draft pieces of privacy legislation. I don't understand how we've reached a point where we, in the United States, are reliant on a foreign regulation to protect our data. Did anyone watch Mark Zuckerberg in front of Congress? It was rather funny how all the senators had to begin by thanking him for his great entrepreneurial spirit, and then ask him why he wasn't following European privacy rules. Because in the lack of an American privacy rules, all the United States Senate has to nail Facebook to the wall is European. I'm not saying that either one of these is good or bad, right or wrong. Obviously, I have my personal opinions and bias, and you've just seen it, but you have the right to disagree with me. That's okay, because we all have a different understanding of what privacy actually means. But who are we? And why does that matter? We make the software that runs the open web. We are people of enormous power and influence over privacy on the internet. We're open source contributors. And we've never acknowledged our differences. And that lack of understanding we have about each other is what we bring to the table when we develop content management systems, and that is every bit as important as the ways we code. Because what happens when our differences meet? We structure our projects with different cultural approaches to privacy in terms of what information can I collect, what information should be collected. We write our code with different legal approaches to privacy. Some of us may think we should structure this in accordance with this law. Some of you don't have laws to structure your work to. But we assume everyone else knows this. We assume everyone else has grown up with the values and the systems and the education we have. We don't know that we don't know each other. So we create the open web with no common standard for privacy. We don't do enough to protect the people in the data who use the services we create, and we don't learn from our mistakes. Well, I'm hoping that changes today, because today I want to give you what you need to know to start the journey together towards an open source best practice standard for privacy, not linked to any law or regulation, but linked to international common values of what privacy actually means. So how do we do that? Well, there's 4 things you need for any project. And one is definitions and principles, one is documentation and resources, one is leadership, and one is community. So let's start with a biggie, and this is kind of obvious, but we've never actually discussed this question. If privacy isn't going to be about GDPR or the Privacy Directive or COPPA, whatever, what is it? What do we mean when we're talking about privacy? So there's 2 kinds of privacy laws that we can take inspiration from. There's hard laws, which is GDPR, the Privacy Directive, COPPAs, HIPAAs, and then things like, I can't pronounce that, but that's the Dutch data protection regulator. And if they say, here's the rules, you've got to follow those rules. Then we have things like soft law, industry codes of conduct, as you see in America. ISO standards, there is an ISO privacy standard. International conventions that have been around longer than most of us have. And development frameworks like privacy by design, which is something I've written about quite a bit. That's been a development framework for anyone to use since the 90s. And it's brilliant. It's like it was just written. What people don't realize is that when politicians are formulating hard laws like GDPR, they look at the soft laws. They look at these standards, they look at these codes of conduct, they look at these conventions, and this is what they did here. So I had a look. I don't expect you to read this, but let's take a look at some various soft law principles and conventions and frameworks and find out what they say about privacy. For the geeks, these are the 5 ones I took. You don't have to look. Yeah, I read this stuff for fun. It's my job. And that might look a bit confusing. These are the principles set out in 5 different international conventions on privacy. Looks a bit confusing. You know, choice, integrity, participation and access, accountability. Well, hold on here. A lot of these are actually the same. Might use different words, but if you read the definitions, it's the exact same principles. And right there, we have a lot more in common than we thought we did. So, across 5 different international policies, frameworks, and standards, there are 11 common values which define what privacy actually means on a code level. And they are data minimization. You should collect only the data you need and nothing more. Data integrity. You should ensure that the data you collect is true, it's authentic, and it's up to date. Purpose minimization. Use the data only for the purpose you collected it for and nothing else. Lifecycle limitation. Do not use it or share it for longer than you need, or share it with people you didn't say you were going to share it with without reason. Human and technical security. Take adequate technical and human measures to protect the data from misuse, whether that's intentional or technical or deliberate, and its subjects from harm. Protect the people in the data. Transparency and notice. Privacy policies. Make public what data you hold, why you hold it, what you do with it, and also make public what standards you use to govern your work. User participation and rights. Give people rights to access their data, to correct mistakes. Give them the ability to ask you to stop using it. Accountability, enforcement, and redress. Fix problems when things go wrong, make it right when people are hurt, and face the consequences for misuse, whether that's public anger or a regulatory subpoena. Choice, control, and consent. Give people choices, give people options, give people rights over the ways that you use their data anytime, and you've seen a lot of this in your inbox in the last fortnight. Special categories of data. Take care with sensitive data, which could result in the people it is about being hurt. Information about people's religion, information about people's health, information about people's sexuality. That's what we talk about when we mean sensitive data. And legal compliance. Work cooperatively with regulations, laws, data protection authorities, Congress. You can't just do this, you have to be accountable. So there you have it. That's 11 globally recognized principles of what constitutes a healthy privacy framework. Now, all of these look familiar, and they should, because all of these were in GDPR. But remember, we're trying to make something that's not necessarily pinned to one law, because people are going to say, I don't have to follow that law, or people don't want to. That's fine. But if you're going to tell me you feel that you don't have to work to GDPR or anything, you have to tell me what you are going to do. You have to tell me what sort of standards you're going to hold yourself accountable to and what rules you're going to follow in your work. You've had these options at any time. Here's a really good suggestion. 11 universal principles. And there's another reason this is important. The buzzword we're hearing from governments from Europe to California and everywhere in between is regulate or be regulated. Our industry is not held in much respect these days. People do think we're the Wild West. We're not, but I can understand how that looks from the outside. And people say, what are you doing about privacy? What are you doing to protect people's data? And if you want to say, well, we're too small, we don't have the legal team, we don't have the resources to do GDPR, that's fine. But you still have to adopt some sort of framework that you work towards on your own. Creating and following what I might call a soft regulation principle, like a framework like that, for user privacy, is going to lessen the chances of hard regulation being imposed on your project. Any one of you who follows EU politics will know any number of EU politicians coming in every couple of months and saying, we're going to check in on Facebook and Google and Amazon and see what they're doing, and this year we're happy with what they're doing, so we're not going to regulate. If you don't want your project to be in that list of companies that governments feel obliged to check on every 6 months to see how you're doing so they don't have to put a law specifically made for you, use something like those principles I've just defined to do it on your own. Because doing nothing is no longer an option, not at a time like this. So I've given you 11 universal privacy principles. Now what do you do with them? You map them to your actual development workflows. So you document how each privacy principle fits into your project. I know you're thinking of Drupal, but I'm trying to make this talk applicable to any project or situation. You need to amend your project guidelines on how your work is structured. So what goes into the project? You amend your development guidelines on how work is coded. What does the actual code have to say? Provide resources for developers to understand how to use any new functionality, and provide resources for site admins to understand why these things matter and what they need to do. So I'm going to show you an example of what that means. Let's take one of our little boxes from before, data minimization. Here's questions you might want to ask. You don't have to write this down. This is just, healthy privacy processes begin with sitting around a table and asking questions, not reading laws. So if you were looking at how does our project minimize data, you would think, okay, what do we do now? What does core do now in terms of data minimization? Does it need to change? What do the development guidelines say? Do we tell developers not to retain data on contact forms for 6 years? Do we give people a chance to delete certain data after 30 days? What do the development guidelines say? Do we tell people to think about data minimization or not? Or do we allow people to keep contact form entries on the database for 6 years? What's our goal? What do we want to achieve? When do we want to ship this? Is this a bug fix? Is this an enhancement? Is this going to be a major version? How do we build in the functionality for data minimization? So if you're going to say, we really think that you should not keep contact form data for more than 6 months, what code do you need to write so that module developers can make that happen? What about modules? Who else needs to be involved here? Do you need to bring in UX? Do you need to bring in marketing? Do you need a lawyer? Lawyer's the last person you need. So an example of those questions in action for an actual project is how we did the WordPress GDPR project. So you can look at these later, but here's just sort of questions we asked. Does your plugin use error logging? Does it involve logging personal data if possible? Could you use things like, and we wrote a filter? So then we document how you can use the filter to answer the question that only you can answer about how you're avoiding logging personal data. In WP admin, what roles or capabilities are required to access or see personal data? Because that's where a lot of data breaches start. Everyone having admin access to data they shouldn't have. So was it really much work to tell developers to think of what minimum level of access should be required to access data so that your editors aren't looking at credit card numbers? How does your plugin handle personal data? And there we've provided an actual filter. So this is a lot of hard work, but it pays off in the end. And here's an example of the actual development guidelines, code example. So here's how you write the function in your plugin to pull information into the privacy notice tool that we've just shipped in 496. You can start to see how it all comes together. The next thing you need for a healthy privacy project is leadership. And yes, privacy is everyone's job, but everyone does need to step up a little. What I always look for in meetups and WordCamps and discussions is I identify the privacy champions. I look for the people who know what they're talking about, who aren't going to throw a tantrum about being told what to do, who are well read up on this stuff, who don't mind reading an 83-page draft document for fun like I did last night, because they're the ones who are going to help you cross the finish line. You do need to involve a variety of roles and backgrounds. For the WordPress GDPR project, we brought in UX, we brought in marketing, we brought in copywriters, we brought in policy people, and yeah, we did bring in legal, but this is never supposed to be about meeting your legal obligations. It's not about this is what the law says we have to do. It's not about do this or get a fine. You need to identify those leaders who are going to cheer you on to do right in your code and do right by people. And don't leave it with lawyers, and I hope we've got no lawyers in the room, but don't expect them to know anything either. The number of lawyers who have come to me and asked me, how does this work? I'm throwing a bit of shade here, but there's a lot of tech lawyers who are tech lawyers because they write contracts for tech companies. They have never written a line of code in their life. That's changing. There are code for lawyers courses. There are really good tech lawyers who actually write and hack and contribute to projects. But every time I see someone talking about GDPR compliance and saying things like, you need to check with your legal counsel, I cringe. Don't waste your time. The only thing you'll need your lawyers for is if there's something you're absolutely not certain of that you want sign off on, or if you're doing something like a contract or data processing agreement with a third party. But the whole point of everything I'm talking about today is to get it out of the preserve of tech lawyers who don't know anything anyway. In your project, I want you to support and educate each other. Don't lecture, don't preach, and don't privacy shame. Privacy shaming is when someone goes on your website and reads your privacy policy because they know you're involved in a privacy project and says, yeah, but you're not doing this. Privacy shaming is when, and this actually happens, privacy companies report each other to their national data protection regulators. So not only does that waste the regulators' time having to deal with their basically personal vendettas, it's a shameful waste of your own time because you could be putting your energies into doing something good. So don't think that you have the time or the luxury to privacy shame and point fingers at people and create some sort of double standard that they're not doing what I'm doing. You've got to respect the fact that we have differing views and find a compromise. You're going to have people who enter your privacy project just to troll it. You're going to have people who are going to mansplain to someone with a university qualification in internet law how internet law works. I get that all the time. You're going to have to agree to disagree. There's no room for zealotry. There's no room for ideologues. You've got to find the happy middle ground that works for everyone. And please provide the project with the resources it needs. In WordPress, we've made privacy a core component now, like accessibility, like polyglots. I'm not sure if it is in Drupal, but it absolutely should be. This shouldn't be something little off to the side. It needs to be a fundamental part of your project. I'm happy to say that you do have some leadership already being shown in the Drupal project. I loved this blog post, thank you very much, Dries, about understanding that there is a need for the project to achieve that happy middle ground between respecting user privacy, making a product that's not going to get your users in trouble, but not stifling innovation on the open web. And that's exactly where we should be. So thank you for that. Final element of any project in open source is community. And I want you to be positive about privacy. You need to support people, you need to empower people, and you need to inspire them. Make privacy, as I said, the focus, not legal compliance. It's not about ticking a box. It's not about not getting sued. Communicate, clarify, create regular blog posts, weekly Slack meetings, marketing team, maybe playing things up in this. Keep a steady flow of information going to the Drupal community about what you're doing and why you're doing it. Encourage privacy talks at conferences and work on contributor days. I really like how there's a privacy focus at the upcoming Drupal Hack Day in Romania. That's really, really cool. Qualify your participants. I'm a bit of a stickler for this, but there's a reason for that. Qualify your participants means just that, as with everything in open source, just because people want to participate doesn't mean they should. If people are showing up 2 weeks aside of a European legal deadline wanting to code and they're asking things like, what does this mean? What does that mean? What do we have to do here? You don't have time for that. Thank them very much for offering to help, but get someone in who's actually done their homework. Another reason it's important to qualify is that, God forbid, if something goes wrong and a regulator comes knocking, as has happened with for example, the Mossack Fonseca data breach, which was the Panama Papers leaks, which was down to a WordPress site and a Drupal site. When the regulator comes knocking and they say, okay, the source of the data breach was the Revolution Slider plugin, which it was. What did the Revolution Slider developers know about data privacy? And if your answer to that is, you've got two problems. You've got the data breach and the fact that you have been caught red-handed, unqualified to code for legal compliance. Be clear on the project goals, be clear on the project constraints, and be clear on the scope of work. Don't try to save the world. Don't put on your Superman privacy cape and try to save privacy in one go. It's okay to tell people, That's a great idea, but we're going to save it for the next release. That's kind of cool. Can we work on that later? And that is exactly what we did on the WordPress GDPR compliance project, which shipped 2 weeks ago in version 4.96. So we very clearly identify our goals. We cannot make WordPress sites compliant. You cannot make Drupal sites compliant. You can only provide the tools and resources that people need to do the right thing. And we made it a little bit easier for them, but we cannot possibly hold people's hands. So we could provide site administrators and users with the tools they need to help them bring their sites into compliance. The project works towards the deadline and the constraints and expectations of GDPR. It does, however, take a wider view of online privacy in general and considers privacy and data protection issues outside its explicit scope for future work. So right there, we identified what we weren't going to do, we identified what we were going to do, and we identified what we were going to hold for later. So we had to be very accommodating of our project constraints. As we said, we couldn't make any site compliant. A site is a combination of themes and modules and core and the infinite ways that people can configure or misconfigure a site to capture data, to share data, to leak data. So all we could do, as I said, is provide some tools. We were very clear that this wasn't going to be the compliance solution. No tool achieves compliance in and of itself, and no tool removes the user's responsibility for compliance. I like to tell people there's no such thing as compliance. There really isn't. Compliance is a journey and a process, but if you think you are compliant, that is the quickest way to fall out of compliance. It's like saying you're healthy. You're healthy now, you may be sick next week. It's about processes and the ways you collect data in every single thing you do every day. It's not just about working towards a checklist and saying, yay, I'm compliant, and never doing anything about it because I'm not compliant anymore. So in our scope of work, what did we do? We did a lot of things. We created tools in WordPress core to allow users to create a GDPR-ready privacy notice without having to be lawyers or developers or both, because those privacy notices need to talk about things like what data your site's capturing, and how is an everyday user going to know about things like contact forms on a database? They're not. So we wanted to put in the functionality so that they don't have to know that. It just shows up in the privacy notice. Under the right to access data and the right to be forgotten, we created tools so that people can request an export of all of their data, and that the same tool just modified so that the administrator can delete it. We created the plugin functionality and hooks to feed the data into these tools. So if the data export tool is going to do all your shopping records from WooCommerce, we had to build in the functionality to WooCommerce to pull those records into the export, and so on and so on. We added some fantastic documentation and help for admins, users, and devs so that everyone coming to this issue from whatever angle can get the information they need, whether it's what filter to use or what the heck are we talking about in the first place. This was my baby, and I'm really proud of it. We removed legal compliance from plugin guidelines, plugins or modules. You can no longer say, if your plugin is in the official repository, that your plugin makes a site compliant in anything. You were seeing a lot of plugins like the GDPR compliance plugin, cookie law compliance plugin, You can say that your plugin assists with various aspects of compliance or creates workflows to help you with certain processes, but the days of activate this plugin and you will be compliant are over. And I highly encourage you to do that with Drupal as well. It wasn't just GDPR and privacy. Somebody found a plugin that was promising to make a site ADA compliant, which was the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that plugin itself was not ADA compliant. There was a plugin in the repo that was a business contracts plugin that had wizards that was telling people that all you have to do is put your information into these wizards and this plugin will spit out a watertight business contract for you. Any business owner idiotic enough to leave their contractual compliance to a free plugin probably deserves what's coming to them, but you can't do that anymore. So there's been something like 250 plugin authors who have been told to change their names and descriptions. And as I said, we identified areas for future work outside the scope of GDPR. Obviously, we were sort of crashing towards a specific deadline. So we have lots of other things we want to do now, and we've now moved them into permanent privacy work. So what didn't we do? And this is just as important. What didn't we do on the WordPress GDPR project. We didn't scaremonger or threaten, discuss penalties, fines, or enforcement at all. If your opening discussion to me about any privacy law involves not getting fined, not getting prosecuted, get out of my face, because that's not what it's about. It is never about fear. It is never about punishment. It's about user protection. So we did not discuss this as a negative compliance obligation in the slightest. We didn't make it a plugin, as I just said. There's been a bit of pushback, particularly from North America, about why didn't we make these things a plugin. We put them into core because they're universal tools. Everyone should probably have a privacy notice. There's nothing European specific about the need to export data. There's nothing European specific about someone exercising their right to ask that the data you hold about them be deleted. The tools were universal. There's no European Union stamp on any of them. We didn't leave the work with legal. We had a lawyer involved with the project who we went to a couple of times when we genuinely needed a second opinion, like, can we do, what do we need to do here? But they were just one face in a crowd. They did not define or control the project in the slightest. We didn't try to save the world in one go. Pragmatism is a good thing to have when you're working on privacy. We met the goals for the deadline and the release, and we filed everything else aside, which we're going to start working on now. We didn't get the version numbering right, but that's a bit of WP drama. I had to acknowledge that. And as I said, we didn't try to save the world in one go, because privacy is not about GDPR. GDPR is not the be-all and end-all of privacy. So on Monday, we are changing our Slack channel's name to Core Privacy from Core Compliance. So we have established privacy as a permanent core component in the WordPress project. And we have 6 maintainers, including myself. And we've got tickets, track tickets. We had 90 the last time I looked. I'm afraid to look again. So that we can now continue working on privacy, not as a European compliance obligation, but as an ethical principle. And we're not alone here. We need to define what we mean by privacy as well. And the guidelines I gave you earlier are where we're going to start. And you're welcome to look at what we're doing, and I highly encourage you to use that as an example, because I've been so impressed by everyone I'm working with, and I'm really proud of them. So we're going to start our roadmaps of V2, V3. Again, be very clear what we're going to tackle, how we're going to tackle it, when we're going to tackle it, what we're going to agree to save for a future date. And we've got WordCamp Europe a couple days from now in Belgrade this year, and I'm running a 3-hour workshop. Agreeing to run a 3-hour workshop sounds like a really good thing when you agree to do it. And it's one of those things where it's great to talk in Slack, but we will all actually be in a room together. And that is where I think we're going to make a lot of progress. That was the easy part. So I've told you how to define privacy as a best practice principle, not linked to law, not linked to regulations, but as a value. Oops. How to provide support and resources, how to provide leadership across the project, and how to involve the community. But I want you to remember, and I've kind of hinted at this already, the most important thing to remember about developing for privacy. It's never about law. It's never about ticking boxes. It's never about jackbooted thugs or greedy companies. It's not about being afraid of a fine. It's about people. It's about the information our users trust us with. Last week, I spoke at a WordCamp in Belfast in Northern Ireland. Today, we're in the Netherlands. Next week, I'm in Belgrade. I'm aware we have people watching on the live stream right now in Rwanda. These are all countries which have experienced government-sanctioned genocides of civilians based on religion, based on who people were, based on where they live. 3 out of 4 of those were in our own lifetime. Okay? Northern Ireland, you had the Troubles, and you still got walls. Here in the Netherlands, 73% of Dutch Jews were executed in World War II. Belgrade, next week. That has been within our lifetimes. Rwanda, what happened in the 90s. The data we collect and hold about people can hurt them. And your simple little module that pulls data onto a database could be a snowflake in a snowball. There has never been more of a need to remember history now, because things are starting to happen again. You need only look at, what was the thing last week about buses of children in America, about the Windrush scandal in Britain, where people who have lived in the country for 55 years are being deported to a country they left as babies, even though they're legal British citizens. People are being targeted again because of who they are. And you have to think about, is the work I'm creating going to play a role in that? And just maybe taking steps to protect user privacy can prevent something from ever happening in the first place. So, with all due respect, forget JavaScript, forget accessibility. Protecting people's privacy is the most important thing you will ever do as a developer. So, thank you for listening, and I'd like to get to work right away. So I will be in the coffee area all the rest of the day if you want to get started on making this happen. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Super informative. We've got a couple of questions from our audience, maybe here, maybe.
See anybody?
So I'm just going to fire away quickly. Just got a couple of minutes. So, top of the list. Okay. So this one says, photo with person is biometric data and we should protect this kind of data. I think it's facial recognition. How do we feel about
biometric data?
Biometric data.
If you've got like general questions about what GDPR is, save them for later, because, yeah.
What is your magic trick to get the discussion on privacy beyond the deadening, but I've got nothing to hide?
Oh, the question was, what's your retort to the question of, I've got nothing to hide, but I've got nothing to fear? Is that an admission that we all should live our lives in public, that we should all be judging each other? Because, you know, within our own lifetime, homosexuality has been illegal. It's not anymore, but used to go to jail for it. As I said, the troubles in Northern Ireland, people's religion is still a thing. What you say you have nothing to hide about, someone else has a very good reason to want to hide about it. And we have privacy as a fundamental right. We have to respect that. One thing I often find working with American companies is like, if a European wants their data deleted, the American wants to ask why. Why? And the European says, I don't have to tell you why. I don't have to justify my right to privacy to anybody. It is my right. But don't structure your code in a way that disrespects those rights or puts your belief about that in front of their rights.
Another question from the audience. Can free services like Facebook, Twitter, can they survive without using user data?
User data isn't bad. Collecting people's data isn't bad. Sharing people's data isn't bad. It's how you protect it and what you do with it. One of the things the Privacy by Design framework, which I encourage you to learn about, I wrote an article about it on Smashing, talks about, is avoiding dichotomies. There's no dichotomy between privacy and security. There shouldn't be a dichotomy between service provision and privacy. There shouldn't be a dichotomy between your ability to see something and privacy. It's what's been done with it, or rather how it's been misused. And that's why we've had these congressional and parliamentary hearings, which are really fascinating to watch. You can use data. You can share it, you can process it, just protect it, govern yourself, and work to any rules that were there. Because again, what they're getting Facebook and Google on is the rules they weren't following. So respect it.
And finally, when I want to make an online donation, I'm often forced to add my address. This is marketing, for example. Will there not be a struggle within the departments?
One common misconception about GDPR is that data rights are absolute. If you're donating to a charity, they are probably required to take your address because there will be a charity regulator that they have to know where their donations are coming from. And you often see that with political scandals when somebody donated money to a candidate they shouldn't have. A charity will have to know who donated to them. Number one, for their own legal compliance purposes, but other thing is for like accounting and taxation. One thing I tell people is like, if you've got a shop and someone asks for their account to be closed, you can delete their data, but you don't have to delete their transaction records because you probably have to keep that for 7 years for taxation purposes anyway. So you don't have to not collect or delete data that you are required to keep for another legal purpose. So a charity donation, they actually do have to know your address, and there are reasons for that. But the marketing opt-in should be separate. Okay?
All right, thanks very much indeed.
I think the biggest